Mafia Boss buys poor disabled girl's birthday cake. What happens next will break your heart. Under the grey weeping sky of a cold afternoon, the small bakery on the corner of Maple Street looked like a fragile refuge against the storm outside, its fogged windows trembling softly as the rain tapped a gentle, endless rhythm upon the glass. And inside that humble space sat a little girl named Lily, just 9 years old, her fragile frame wrapped in a faded pink sweater that had once been bright, but now carried the dull wear of time and struggle. She sat quietly on a wooden chair near the window, her small fingers gripping a single crumpled dollar bill as though it were a treasure, her crutches leaning beside her chair like silent, loyal companions, their metal edges slightly rusted from years of use, reflecting the faint glow of the shop's weak yellow lights. The bakery itself smelled of sugar and cinnamon, of warm bread and melting butter. Yet even that sweetness couldn't hide the heaviness that hung in the air as Lily's eyes stayed fixed on the display case before her, where a small cupcake sat on a white ceramic plate, covered in soft pink frosting and topped with one delicate candle that waited for someone, anyone, to claim it. She stared at it as though it were the most beautiful thing in the world, her lips curving into a faint, wistful smile that fought against the tears quietly building behind her lashes. And the baker, a tired man in his 50s named Mr. Dalton, glanced at her from behind the counter with a mixture of pity and helplessness. He had seen her before, many times in fact, always coming to look at the same little cakes, always polite, never demanding, always holding that same dollar like it was her only link to joy. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and almost ashamed. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It costs $5, he said softly, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron, wishing there was a way he could give it to her without feeling like charity. Lily's smile trembled but did not break. She shook her head gently, her eyes still locked on the cupcake. "It's okay, sir," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange calmness for a child. "I'll just look at it for a while. Pretend it's mine." Those words lingered in the air like a fragile song, filling the quiet room with an ache that even the hum of the ovens couldn't drown out. She rested her chin on her small hands, humming the faint tune of Happy Birthday under her breath, her voice thin but pure, like a thread of light weaving through the storm's grey shadows outside. The candle's reflection shimmered faintly in her eyes, and in that moment, the whole world seemed to shrink down to just her, the cupcake, and the window that separated her dreams from reality. Mr. Dalton turned away, pretending to busy himself with a tray of pastries, because watching her broke something in him each time. He had children once, grown and gone now, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of world lets a child celebrate a birthday alone with only $1 and her imagination. Outside, cars splashed through puddles, horns echoed in the distance, and the neon sign above the shop flickered weakly, its light cutting through the mist just enough to make the place look alive. Inside, the ticking of the clock above the counter felt louder than ever, each second stretching painfully long as Lily continued to hum, her little foot swinging slightly under the chair, her thin leg trembling from effort. She imagined what it would feel like to have a birthday party, a real one, with balloons, candles, maybe even someone to sing with her. She pictured her late father's laugh, her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder, but reality always snapped back too quickly. All she had was the dollar, the cupcake behind the glass, and her imagination to fill the empty spaces left by life's cruelty. The baker cleared his throat, opened his mouth as though to say something, maybe even to tell her she could take the cake. But before he could speak, the soft jingle of the doorbell cut through the silence, followed by a sudden drop in temperature that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. The door creaked open slowly, and through the faint haze of rain and light stepped a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence heavy, commanding, and cold enough to make the baker freeze mid-motion. His polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor, and the sound echoed like footsteps of authority. Behind him, the storm seemed to pause, as though the rain itself feared to touch him. The man removed his hat, revealing slicked-back dark hair, sharp eyes that carried both intelligence and danger, and a scar that traced a thin line along his jaw, one that told stories of violence without a single word. He wasn't just anyone. Everyone in the city knew that face, even if they pretended not to. Marco Romano, the most feared mafia boss in the city, had just stepped into the small bakery, a place too humble, too pure for the darkness that followed him. The baker's hands trembled slightly as he tried to hide his recognition, while Lily, oblivious to the weight of this man's identity, only looked up out of curiosity, her eyes meeting his for a brief second. Something shifted in that brief exchange, a spark of innocence meeting a lifetime of sin. And though neither spoke, the air between them felt charged with something indescribable. Marco scanned the room slowly, his gaze passing over every corner as if measuring it for danger, until his eyes returned to the little girl by the window. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The child with the dollar, and the man with power beyond measure, two worlds about to collide under the hum of a flickering light and the soft patter of rain, their destinies unknowingly entwined in that small, quiet bakery on the loneliest birthday Lily would ever have. The moment the bell above the bakery door fell silent, a heavy tension gripped the air, so thick it felt like even the walls dared not breathe as Marco Romano's men entered behind him, their dark suits drenched from the rain, each one scanning the room with trained precision, eyes sharp, hands close to their jackets as if danger could come from anywhere, though in truth, they were the danger. The sound of their polished shoes on the tiled floor echoed through the small bakery like a heartbeat, steady and slow, while the smell of gun oil faintly mixed with the scent of sugar and bread, a strange reminder of how two worlds, innocence and crime, had collided in that fragile space. Mr. Dalton, the baker, stood frozen behind the counter, the color draining from his face as he recognized the man before him, his hands still dusted with flour, trembling slightly as he tried to muster words. Marco, tall and composed, exuded an aura that silenced rooms before he even spoke, his sharp features and cold eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Yet, as the hum of the oven and the faint ticking of the clock filled the background, one small figure in the corner remained untouched by the tension. Lily sat still by the window, her chin resting on her palm, her eyes lost in the cupcake behind the glass, completely unaware that the most feared man in the city now stood just a few feet away. While everyone else in the bakery had lowered their heads, afraid to make eye contact, she stayed in her small world, her imagination still painting quiet birthdays and candle-lit dreams. Marco's gaze followed her, curiosity flickering in his cold eyes, something he didn't expect to feel, a break in his habitual detachment. His men positioned themselves near the door, by the window, one keeping a hand near his jacket pocket, but Marco ignored them, his attention narrowing on the girl with crutches who looked far too calm in a room full of fear. He approached the counter, his presence a storm of silence, and the baker immediately bowed his head slightly, voice quivering. "Mr. Romano, what can I get for you today?" Marco's tone was low, smooth, but carried that dangerous edge that made grown men stutter. "Coffee, black." The baker nodded hurriedly, fumbling with the cup, spilling a bit as his hands shook. Marco didn't scold him. He didn't even look at him for long. His eyes, instead, shifted again to the small figure in the corner, the faint sound of her humming reaching his ears, and for reasons he couldn't understand, it pulled something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. He walked toward her slowly, his shadow falling over her table. The light from the window touched his face in fragments, outlining the lines of experience, of pain, of power built on blood and fear. But the girl didn't flinch. She looked up only when she realized someone stood before her. Her eyes were large and bright, the kind that had never known real hatred, only the softness of imagination and the ache of loneliness. "Why are you crying, kid?" he asked, his voice rough, carrying the weight of command yet dipped in unexpected curiosity. Lily blinked, startled by the directness of the question, and then looked down at her lap. Her fingers nervously rubbed the edge of the dollar bill she still held. "Because it's my birthday, sir," she said softly, almost as if confessing a secret to a stranger she somehow trusted. "And I only have $1. The simplicity of her words pierced through the silence, through the weight of the storm, and straight into Marco's chest like a blade he never saw coming. He wasn't a man easily moved. He'd built his empire by silencing emotion, by making sure weakness had no place in his heart. Yet as he looked at her trembling hands and that single wrinkled dollar, something inside him cracked. He saw an image he thought he had buried deep in the graveyard of his memories. His little daughter, Elena, no older than this girl, laughing with a cupcake in her tiny hands, her hair tied with ribbons, her smile brighter than the sun. That image burned like fire now, because Elena was gone, stolen by an accident years ago, the same accident that had left him hollow, dangerous, and untouchable. For a second, the bakery disappeared. All he saw was that memory overlapping with the present, the same small shoulders, the same innocent eyes, the same trembling voice asking for something simple and beautiful. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady the sudden wave of emotion that threatened to rise. But even his men noticed the shift in his expression, exchanging uncertain glances because they had never seen Marco Romano soften. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, tapping against the glass like 1,000 tiny hands trying to break the tension, and Lily's voice filled the silence again, unafraid. "It's okay, though. I'm used to it." She gave him a faint smile, the kind that tries to be brave even when everything hurts. Marco didn't respond right away. He just stared, his mind at war with his heart. He had seen blood, betrayal, fear. He had stared into the eyes of dying men without flinching. But this small moment of unguarded honesty from a child, was harder to face than any bullet he'd ever dodged. Mr. Dalton set the cup of coffee on the counter quietly, afraid to interrupt whatever strange connection was forming between the Mafia boss and the lonely girl. Marco finally spoke, his tone lower now, not the voice of a man giving orders, but of someone searching for something he'd long forgotten. "What's your name, kid?" She looked up again, surprised by the gentleness that had crept into his voice. "Lily," she said shyly. "My mom says it means hope." Marco exhaled, slowly, the word lingering in his mind like smoke. Hope, a word that didn't belong in his world anymore. He nodded faintly, almost as if acknowledging her existence in a way that meant more than she could understand. For a brief, fleeting moment his hard exterior softened. Behind his cold eyes, a storm of memories swirled, his daughter's laughter, his wife's smile, the sound of a birthday song that once filled his mansion but had long since been replaced by the silence of guilt and regret. He turned slightly, as if to walk away, to escape the feeling building inside him, but his feet wouldn't move. The warmth radiating from that little girl's innocence anchored him there, making him feel human for the first time in years. His men watched quietly, exchanging glances, unsure of what to do. The baker, sensing something sacred unfolding, stayed perfectly still. The storm outside began to ease, the rhythm of the rain softening, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. Marco finally took a deep breath, his expression unreadable, but his heart, long frozen under layers of crime and pain, had just felt its first crack. And though he didn't yet know it, that one simple conversation with a poor disabled girl and her single dollar would be the spark that would begin to melt the ice around his soul. The silence that lingered in the bakery after Lily's innocent words seemed endless, like time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. The soft tick of the wall clock echoed through the air, blending with the faint hiss of the coffee machine and the fading sound of rain outside. Marco Romano stood motionless, his broad frame casting a shadow across the floor as his men waited quietly, confused by the strange stillness in their boss. The girl's soft eyes still looked up at him, unsure but unafraid, and something about that gaze tore through the steel armor he had built around his heart for years. His jaw tightened, and before anyone could guess his next move, he snapped his fingers sharply, a single command that carried the weight of authority only a man like him could wield. The sound was crisp, immediate, and his men straightened instantly. "Buy every cake in this shop," he ordered in a calm yet unyielding voice that made even the clock seem to stop ticking. The baker froze mid-motion, his mouth parting slightly as if he hadn't heard right. The air thickened with disbelief. Marco's tone didn't rise, didn't need to. It was the kind of voice that could build empires or destroy them, but this time, it wasn't delivering a threat. It was delivering grace. One of his men stepped forward, hesitated, and then quietly pulled out a thick roll of cash, placing it on the counter without question. The baker's eyes widened. The stack of bills looked surreal against the worn wood. But, sir—" "That's too much," Mr. Dalton stammered, still clutching his apron, not daring to move closer. Marco didn't even glance his way. His gaze stayed on Lily. The hardness in his expression had softened into something almost unrecognizable, a faint echo of warmth he thought he'd buried forever. He moved closer, each step slow and deliberate until he stood right before the little girl. Lily's small fingers gripped her crutches as she tilted her head up to meet his eyes, uncertain but curious. And then, to everyone's astonishment, Marco slowly lowered himself onto one knee beside her chair. The most feared man in the city, the one whose name made criminals and cops alike hold their breath, was now kneeling before a child who had nothing but $1 to her name. The baker's hand froze mid-air. The men by the door exchanged silent, startled glances. Marco reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out something small, glittering faintly under the warm light of the bakery, a delicate diamond-studded bracelet. It wasn't new. The edges were smooth from years of being held, touched, remembered. He looked at it for a moment before holding it out toward her small hand. "Happy birthday, princess," he said softly, and his voice no longer carried command, only tenderness. The words were gentle, trembling almost, as though they came from somewhere deep within him that hadn't spoken in years. Lily's breath caught as she looked at the sparkling bracelet resting on his palm. Her tiny hand hesitated in the air, trembling as she reached out but then pulled back, shaking her head. "Sir, I can't take this," she whispered, her voice filled with honesty, her eyes wide with disbelief. The sight of her innocence nearly broke him. He gave a faint, weary smile, one that didn't belong to the ruthless man people feared, but to a father who once knew love. "You just did," he murmured, gently placing the bracelet in her hand and curling her small fingers around it. The cold metal against her skin felt unreal, like holding a piece of magic she never believed she'd touch. The diamonds shimmered faintly, catching the light like captured stars. Around them, the bakery remained still. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Mr. Dalton's eyes glistened as he watched, his chest tightening with something that felt like witnessing a miracle. Marco stood slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softer than before. He turned to the baker, his tone calm but firm. "Feed every hungry kid that walks in here," he said. "On me." The words dropped like a thunderclap of kindness, shocking in their simplicity, yet powerful enough to change lives. The baker's lips parted, his voice caught between gratitude and disbelief. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Marco waved a dismissive hand. "Then don't," he replied quietly. "Just do it." His man at the counter nodded, leaving another wad of cash beside the register, enough to cover months, maybe years, of food for those in need. The sound of money hitting wood was soft, but carried more meaning than a gunshot ever could. Lily's eyes followed Marco as he stepped back, her fingers still clutched around the bracelet. She didn't understand who he really was, or why he had done it, but she felt something change in the air around her. The heaviness that had filled the room when he first entered was gone, replaced by something lighter, something human. For the first time that day she smiled, a real smile, small but radiant. Marco saw it, and for a brief second his chest ached with memories he had long tried to forget. The girl's smile reminded him of laughter that once echoed through marble halls, of birthday candles blown out by a child who bore his name. He blinked, forcing the memories back into the shadows, but the feeling lingered stubbornly. His men were still silent, visibly confused, their eyes darting between him and the girl. They weren't used to seeing their boss like this, stripped of the cold mask that usually defined him. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, sunlight beginning to peek through the thinning clouds. It slipped through the window, falling across Lily's face, illuminating the diamonds in her hand and the faint shimmer in Marco's eyes. Mr. Dalton cleared his throat softly, still stunned, and whispered, "She'll never forget this, sir." Marco didn't answer, but his jaw clenched slightly, a subtle sign of emotion fighting its way through years of control. The warmth in that small room seemed to melt something inside him that had been frozen for too long. He looked once more at Lily, her innocence, her gratitude, her quiet wonder, and something deep in his chest shifted again. Without another word, he turned and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crisp white handkerchief. He handed it to her with an almost fatherly gesture. "Wipe your tears, birthday girl," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes bright, her small voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you, sir." Her words were simple. But they carried a purity that no amount of wealth could buy. Everyone in the bakery stood motionless, watching this unlikely moment unfold, the feared mafia boss kneeling before a poor disabled girl, gifting her kindness instead of power. And for the first time in years, the great Marco Romano felt something wet on his cheek. He didn't notice it at first, but when he didn't wipe it away. It wasn't weakness, it was release. A single tear rolled down his face and fell silently to the floor, disappearing into the cracks of the old tile, like a seed planting itself deep in the soil of redemption. In that moment, no one saw a criminal. No one saw a king of the underworld. They saw a man, broken yet reborn, finding a piece of his lost humanity in the eyes of a child who had nothing but love left to give. The night had fallen heavy and slow, draping the city in a blanket of black velvet, broken only by the orange flicker of streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt. Marco Romano sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, the engine humming softly beneath him as rain pattered gently against the tinted windows. The world outside was a blur of motionless lights, empty sidewalks, and distant sirens that came and went like ghosts. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The scent of leather filled the air, mingling with faint traces of smoke from the cigar he hadn't lit. His men sat silently in the front, uncertain whether to speak or not. The tension wasn't born of fear this time. It was the strange, fragile kind that comes when something unexplainable has happened. Marco leaned back, his gloved hand resting against his chin, his eyes half closed, not with fatigue, but with the weight of thoughts he didn't know how to contain. His driver, a man named Carlo, who had been with him for over a decade, glanced at him through the rear-view mirror. He'd seen his boss in every possible state, furious, ruthless, triumphant, but never like this. The silence stretched until Carlo finally dared to speak, his voice low and cautious. "Boss, you okay?" Marco didn't respond right away. His gaze remained fixed on the blurred city lights beyond the glass, his mind lost somewhere far from the streets they drove through. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the rain, carrying a softness that made even the driver straighten in surprise. "My daughter," he whispered, almost to himself. "She'd be her age today." The words hung in the air like a confession to no one, like a truth pulled from a wound that had never healed. Carlo's eyes flicked up again just for a second, and in that second he saw something he never thought he would see: grief in Marco Romano's face. The mafia boss, the man who had ordered empires to rise and enemies to vanish, was now just a father remembering the sound of laughter that time had stolen. Outside, a neon sign flickered in a puddle, its reflection rippling with every drop of rain. Marco's eyes softened as he stared into nothing, his mind replaying the fragments of a past he had buried under years of violence. He could still hear Elena's laugh, high, pure, unfiltered joy. He could still feel the weight of her small hand clutching his finger as they crossed streets together. And then came the memory that never faded, the one that visited him every night, no matter how much whiskey he poured or how many enemies he silenced. The rain that night had been heavier than this one. His wife, Isabella, had been driving with Eleanor in the back seat. He had been late getting home. He remembered the call, the one that split his world in half. The sound of sirens in the background, the trembling voice of the officer telling him there was nothing left to save. His hand clenched unconsciously now, his knuckles whitening as the image of twisted metal and shattered glass filled his thoughts. He had arrived too late. He remembered the streetlights glinting off the wreckage, the way Isabella's scarf lay tangled in the debris, the tiny pink shoe lying in the rain. After that night, something inside him had died too. The man who had once known how to love was buried alongside them. What remained was a shell. Ruthless, unfeeling, efficient. He built walls made of power and money, hid behind an empire of fear, and convinced himself that feeling nothing was strength. But earlier that day, in a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and hope, a little girl's smile had cracked the armor he had spent years forging. He hadn't realized it then, but now, alone in the car, he could feel it. Like a fracture spreading through stone, small but unstoppable. He closed his eyes, his breathing deep, steady, but beneath it was a tremor, a pulse that felt too human. He could still see Lily's face in his mind, the way her eyes had lit up when she smiled, the way her voice had trembled when she said thank you. It was innocent, untainted, completely free of the fear that usually followed him wherever he went. That look, that simple gratitude, had reached somewhere inside him no bullet ever could. Marco let out a slow breath and turned his head toward the window. The glass was streaked with rain, the world outside distorted and distant, just like his emotions had been for years. But now he saw reflections, his own face overlapping the passing city, a stranger he barely recognized. He looked older tonight. The power in his eyes was still there, but behind it was exhaustion, sorrow, and something else. A quiet yearning for redemption. Carlo kept his eyes on the road, wisely saying nothing more, but he could feel the shift in the air, a heaviness mixed with something fragile. Marco reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his cufflinks, then the softer touch of a folded handkerchief. He pulled it out slowly, staring at it under the faint light from the dashboard. It was the same one he had handed to Lily earlier that day. A small thing, insignificant to most, but now it carried meaning, proof that for one fleeting moment he had done something good. His thumb traced the fabric as if it could connect him, back to that moment, to that feeling he hadn't known in so long. He thought of the way Lily's tiny hand had clutched the bracelet, the way her voice had said, "Thank you, sir." He hadn't realized it at the time, but that thank you had changed him. It had been so long since he had done something without gain, without control, without fear. He had spent years building walls of loyalty and power, yet a child had shown him that true power didn't come from fear. It came from compassion. Marco leaned back, letting his head rest against the seat, his gaze following the raindrops racing down the window. He didn't cry, not like before. The tear he had shed earlier in the bakery had been the first in years, and it had taken everything in him to let it fall. Now there was no tear, just a quiet ache, a stirring warmth in the hollow part of his chest that had been cold for too long. His voice, barely audible, escaped into the dark interior. "Hope," he murmured, recalling the name she had given him earlier. "Lily means hope." He closed his eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that came from a memory rather than joy. For the first time in years, Marco Romano wasn't thinking about money, power, or revenge. He was thinking about a little girl's birthday wish, a dollar bill, a cupcake behind glass, and the simple truth that kindness could still exist even in the darkest of places. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving the streets glistening like polished obsidian. The car continued to glide through the city, past lights and shadows, past the ghosts of his past, and into the unknown of what might come next. But inside Marco's heart, a tiny ember had been reignited, small, fragile, but burning nonetheless. He didn't know what it meant yet, or what it would change, but he felt it, the faint stirring of something long forgotten. The cold heart of a mafia king had felt warmth again, not from fear, not from guilt, but from the smile of a child who had nothing, and yet somehow gave him everything he had lost. A glimpse of hope. The morning sun spilled gently over the cobblestone street, washing the world in gold. Marco Romano's black car rolled to a stop in front of the small bakery, its reflection shimmering in the glass windows. The sign above the door still read Sweet Haven, the same place where a few days ago his heart had been cracked open by a little girl's innocent smile. He sat there for a moment before getting out, staring at the door as if it were the entrance to another life entirely. The usual crowd of pedestrians passed by, some glancing at the expensive car, none daring to approach. He took a deep breath, straightened his dark suit jacket, and stepped out. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly as he entered. The scent of warm bread and vanilla filled the air, wrapping him in an unexpected calm. For a moment, it didn't feel like a place of business. It felt like home. Behind the counter, a woman looked up. Her hands were dusted with flour, her hair tied loosely back, and there was a kindness in her tired eyes that spoke of both strength and struggle. "Mr. Romano," she said nervously, wiping her hands on her apron, I didn't think you'd come back." Marco gave a slight nod, his voice low and steady. "I wanted to check on the little one. Lily, right?" The woman's expression softened instantly. "She's in the back, helping decorate cupcakes. She hasn't stopped talking about you since that day." Her lips trembled with a grateful smile. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. You changed her life." Marco's gaze shifted toward the doorway that led to the kitchen. He could hear faint giggles, the kind that made his chest tighten in a strange, almost painful way. "No thanks needed," he replied quietly. "Sometimes a smile is payment enough." The woman, Sarah, watched him for a moment, sensing something deeper in his tone, something unspoken. As she turned to grab a tray of pastries, Marco's eyes wandered around the shop. It had a charm to it, small tables with mismatched chairs, flowers in old glass jars, and walls lined with family photos. He wasn't the kind of man who usually noticed details like that, but today, something on the far wall caught his attention. A single framed photograph. The sunlight hit it just right, making the glass gleam. Marco took a few steps closer, his heart thudding strangely. The photo showed a younger man holding a baby, smiling with pride. His clothes were simple, his eyes kind, his arm wrapped around a woman who looked just like Sarah. Marco froze. The world around him faded into silence. His hand trembled slightly as he reached toward the frame, his fingertips brushing against the glass. That face. He knew it. Every line, every feature, every memory behind those eyes came rushing back like a wave crashing through his chest. The bakery, the warmth, the noise, all disappeared. He was no longer in that shop. He was back in another time, years ago, in the Romano estate, standing beside his younger brother Matteo. The memory burned bright. Matteo had always been the gentler one, the dreamer, the man who spoke of freedom while Marco built walls of power. He remembered the arguments, the shouting, the night Matteo walked out, saying he wanted nothing to do with the family's dark empire. Marco had let him go. Pride had silenced his heart back then. He told himself Matteo was weak, that he'd never survive without the family name. But now, Staring at this photo, Marco realized how wrong he'd been. His throat tightened, a storm brewing inside him. "Where did you get this picture?" he asked, his voice rough, almost breaking. Sarah turned from the counter, confused by the change in his tone. "That? Oh, that's my late husband. His name was Matteo." The name hit him like a gunshot. Marco took a slow step back, his pulse pounding into his ears. "Matteo," he whispered, tasting the name like something sacred. Sarah nodded softly, unaware of the history unfolding before her eyes. "He was a good man," she said. "He never talked much about his past, only that he came from a family he wanted to leave behind. He didn't want that life for us. He passed away 5 years ago." Marco's knees felt weak. He turned slightly, one hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. His mind reeled. The brother he'd spent years searching for, mourning, resenting, had been here all along. Living quietly, happily, away from the darkness Marco had chosen. And Lily, innocent, kind, pure-hearted Lily, was his brother's child. His blood. His niece. The realization washed over him like fire and ice colliding in his chest. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His life, the violence, the empire he had built, all of it suddenly felt meaningless compared to this one truth. "Mr. Romano?" Sarah's voice broke through his daze. He turned toward her slowly, his eyes glistening but his face unreadable. "Did he ever mention me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She hesitated, sensing the depth behind the question. "Once," she said gently. "He told me he had an older brother, said you were strong, but that life pulled you both in different directions. He wished things could have been different." Marco closed his eyes, a single tear escaping before he could stop it. For years, he had carried anger, believing Matteo had abandoned him, believing that love made men weak. Now he understood. Matteo hadn't abandoned him. He had escaped to protect his family from the curse of their world. Marco turned his head, and through the open door to the kitchen, he saw Lily laughing, her small hands covered in icing, her face glowing with joy. She looked so much like her father had at that age. The same sparkle in the eyes, the same warmth in her smile. The ache in his chest deepened, but this time it wasn't pain. It was something softer, something fragile and alive. He walked slowly toward the doorway, standing there silently as he watched her. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was humming to herself, placing little sugar flowers on a cake. "You're a natural," Sarah said behind him, smiling softly. Matteo would have been proud of her. Marco nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. The name echoed in his head again and again. Proud. Matteo. Lily. Family. Words that had once meant nothing to him were now everything. For so long he had ruled through fear, surrounded by men who called him boss, but none who truly cared. And yet here, in this small bakery filled with warmth and laughter, he had found something purer than all the gold he'd ever touched. His own blood, his lost family, his second chance. When Lily finally turned and saw him, she grinned widely, waving her icing-covered hand. "Mr. Marco, you came back." He managed a smile, his voice low but full of emotion. "Of course I did, kiddo. Couldn't miss your cupcakes, could I?" She giggled, running up to show him her messy creation, completely unaware of the truth that had just shattered and healed his heart in the same breath. As he looked at her, something shifted deep inside him. The empire he had built suddenly seemed small compared to the legacy his brother had left behind. A legacy of kindness, honesty, and love. For the first time in decades, Marco felt something new blooming within him. Not guilt, not anger, but a quiet gratitude that fate had brought him here, to this moment, to her. He took a deep breath, the air tasting different, lighter somehow. The walls he had lived behind for so long began to crumble. As he looked at Sarah and Lily, his brother's family, He realized the universe had given him a miracle he didn't deserve, the chance to make things right. The small bakery smelled of sugar and warmth that morning, sunlight streaming softly through the window as if heaven itself was watching over them. Marco stood silently by the counter, his heart pounding in his chest as Lily looked up at him with her bright, curious eyes. The truth was sitting heavy in his soul, waiting to be spoken. For years, he had carried guilt, violence, and loneliness like armor. But now, standing before the girl who unknowingly mended the cracks in his heart, that armor felt too heavy to bear. His lips trembled as he crouched down, lowering himself to her height. The world around them seemed to fade, the sounds of the city, the distant hum of conversation, even the air itself held still. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his deep voice breaking with emotion. "I think I'm your uncle." For a brief moment, the words hung between them, almost unreal, like a secret too fragile to touch. Lily blinked, her eyes widening as if trying to understand, then a slow, trembling smile spread across her face. "Then I'm not alone anymore," she said softly, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. The warmth of her hug shattered him completely. Tears streamed down his face as he held her close, feeling for the first time in decades what love without condition truly felt like. Sarah stood nearby, her hand covering her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes as she realized what this moment meant. Not just for her daughter, but for the broken man before her who had just found the missing piece of his soul. The bakery was filled with silence, but it wasn't empty. It was alive with the kind of quiet that holds peace. For Marco, it was the moment the world changed forever. He had spent years building an empire of fear, surrounding himself with shadows, and now a single child's embrace had brought him back into the light. That night, as he sat alone in his mansion, the walls that once echoed with silence now seemed unbearable. The gold, the cars, the suits, none of it mattered. The ghosts of his past no longer frightened him. They only reminded him of the lives he had yet to rebuild. The next morning, the men who once followed his every order were stunned when Marco gathered them all in his grand hall. "It's over," he said simply, his voice calm but unyielding. "From this day forward, everything changes." Some stared in disbelief, others whispered among themselves, but Marco didn't care. He was done ruling through fear. He was done with blood and power. He was done being the man people feared in the dark. "Take what you've earned and go live your lives," he said. "Find something worth more than money, because I finally have." And with that, the empire of Marco Romano began to crumble, not in violence or betrayal, but in peace. The city's most feared name became a ghost of its past, whispered only in stories. But in one small corner of that same city stood a bakery filled with laughter. Weeks turned into months, and Marco found himself returning every morning, not as a boss or a leader, but as family. He helped Sarah with deliveries, sometimes clumsily trying to decorate cakes, while Lily giggled at his failed attempts. "You're getting better," she'd tease, and he'd chuckle softly. "You're a terrible liar, kiddo." Yet every word from her lips was a melody that healed him a little more each day. The locals soon came to know Marco not as a criminal, but as the kind man who bought extra bread for orphans, who fixed the old benches outside the bakery, who donated quietly to schools and hospitals without ever leaving his name. His face, once cold and feared, now carried a warmth that made strangers smile. Sarah noticed the change too. The sharpness in his eyes had softened. The burden in his shoulders had lifted. Sometimes she'd catch him watching Lily play, and in his gaze she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: peace. The day of Lily's next birthday arrived, and the bakery was unrecognizable. Balloons hung from the ceiling, ribbons danced in the air, and tables were filled with cakes of every kind: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, even a massive three-tiered one right in the center. The once small, lonely bakery had become a place of celebration, laughter, and love. Lily stood in the middle, her smile brighter than the candles that flickered before her. Marco stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, wearing a simple black suit, not the kind of man who commanded armies, but the kind who protected hearts. "Go on," he said softly. "Make a wish." Lily closed her eyes, her little fingers clasped together, and whispered something under her breath before blowing out the candles. Everyone clapped and cheered, and she turned to Marco, her eyes sparkling. "I wished we could stay like this forever." Marco smiled, feeling the lump rise in his throat. "Then that's one wish I'll make come true," he said, pulling her into a hug. Around them, the air was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of love reborn. Sarah watched them from across the room, tears of gratitude tracing her cheeks. For so long, life had been hard, lonely even. But now, she saw in Marco not the shadow of his past, but the promise of a brighter future. As evening fell and the guests began to leave, Marco stepped outside, watching the golden sunset stretch across the horizon. The city that once feared his name now seemed softer, quieter. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face. For the first time in his life, the weight was gone. Inside the bakery, Lily was laughing with Sarah, her joy echoing through the open door. He smiled to himself, realizing that this simple life, this love, was what he had been searching for all along. As night settled, the lights from the bakery glowed warmly against the darkness. Marco turned back to join them, his footsteps light, his heart full. No longer the man who ruled with fear, he was now a man reborn in love. The world might still call him the Mafia Boss, but to one little girl, he was simply Uncle Marco. The man who showed her that even the darkest hearts can find light again. And as he lifted Lily into his arms, her laughter filling the air, Marco Romano knew he'd finally found what all the power in the world could never buy: a family, a home, and a heart finally healed.